Whether one is listening to this in Myanmar or from outside the country, we know it is a very difficult time for those of us who hold the Golden Land and its people in our hearts. In trying times like these, we can all use a bit more care and compassion in our lives. So on behalf of the team here at Insight Myanmar, I would like to say, in the traditional way metta is offered, may you be free from physical discomfort. May you be free from mental discomfort. May you not meet dangers or enemies. May you live a peaceful and happy life. And may all beings be free and come out of suffering. And with that, let's move on to the show. Really excited for this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast to welcome author, teacher, meditator, probably some other professions there as well, Kory Goldberg, share some of his story and his experiences and perspective. Kory, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Joa. It's a real honor to be with you today. It's a real privilege. I really love the work that you've been doing. I've been following your podcast and your Better Burma project and Insight Myanmar, and Burma Dhamma and all these things. So it's great to finally sit down and talk to you about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're definitely someone I wanted to have on for some time. You've done so much in your life, both professional and personal and meditative, as we'll get into. And actually, let's just jump into that right now. So just take us from where you're from and how you grew up and where your spiritual path began.
Okay, well, right now I live in the eastern townships of Quebec. That's southern Quebec, just on north of the Vermont border. And I run a permaculture farm with my wife, and that are rooted in principles of Dhamma and permaculture, and we try to blend that together. I'm also teaching in the humanities department at a small college called Champlain College. And so that's where I'm at right now, and I'm still practicing in the Goenka tradition, and have two kids, 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, and they are my greatest teachers at the moment. Yeah. So I've been sitting with the Goenka tradition since 1997. I did my first course in Dharamsala, Dhammasikara. And I've been just sitting and serving courses ever since then. Obviously, since having a full-time job and children and farm and all this, my implications are not what they used to be, but I do what I can, and I integrate the Dhamma into my daily life as much as I can. So I grew up in Montreal. I grew up in a small Jewish community, English-speaking Jewish community. Most of Quebec is French, but I grew up in a small English enclave. And my family, we were mostly secular, although we practiced the culture. We did some of the standard, practice some of the standard holidays, but we weren't religious by any means. But the religious aspects always did have a place in my heart. And as I grew up, and I was trying to find deeper spiritual meaning in Judaism, I just wasn't able to find it. There were a couple of books out there, but just from a practice perspective, teacher perspective, nothing really connected with me. And then once I got to college, I started reading books about different spiritual traditions. I did my undergraduate degree in anthropology and international development studies, but I did have a minor in religion. And so that brought me to reading about Buddhism and yoga and Sufism and different mystical traditions. And when I was about 19, I started traveling in India and came across different kinds of practices. And I just experimented with many different practices in Buddhist and yogic traditions. And then finally in 1997, I took my first course. And when I took that course, I remember sitting on the cushion on day 0, and I heard Goenka start the course with Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. And when I heard that, I said, this is what I was looking for. And from that moment, there was just something that resonated so deeply with me. And receiving those Anapana instructions on that day 0, I knew altered the rest of my life, the course of the rest of my life.
That's interesting, because I'm just smiling because I know many dedicated meditators who will reference the first time they heard the chanting and will say, when I heard that chanting, I was like, what the hell am I doing here? I'm in a cult. I need to run away. And then then they go on and they become developed in the practice, and they realize the value of it. But for so many meditators I've talked to, they have the opposite reaction. So it's interesting that connected with you from the start.
Yeah, I think it depends where you're from. And I could see that happening and I do meet a lot of people who have that experience, especially when they're doing their first course in the West. But at the time, I was a free spirit. I was not to say I'm not a free spirit now, but I was a much freer spirit, or a different kind of free spirit back then. 17, 18, 19. And actually, I did that course on my second visit to India. My second visit to India, I was 19, and I was there for a year. I was doing a study abroad program in international development studies with the University of Minnesota. And when the program ended, I realized, hey, I still have 6 months left on my visa. I still have some money in my pocket. There's no way I'm going back to school right now. Like I'm gonna travel around and just keep seeking out for whatever I was seeking out, the truth, a path to ultimate truth, connectedness, interdependence. I was just looking for something. And I was also looking for a teacher. In the early parts of my travels, I had heard about Vipassana. It did attract me, but the opportunity never arose. And I was at the Losar. I was able to take a break from my studies for a month, and I went to the Losar celebration, the Tibetan New Year celebration, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama gives a teaching at that time. He usually gives, at that time, it was a 2-week or a 3-week teaching, and he was giving a commentary on some meditation text. And I went to that every day, and I came across a monk who is actually Canadian in the Tibetan tradition. And I actually met him several months before. I had spent a couple of weeks in Bodhgaya. It was like one of my first weeks in the country before my program started. And I went to this place called the Root Institute of Wisdom and Culture. It's a socially engaged meditation center in the tradition of Lama Zopa. And there was a retreat going on. And, this was before the internet. This was actually, so this is December 1996. And I'm standing in line hoping to take part in this retreat. I really wanted to learn meditation. And I was actually in Varanasi before that. And somebody just came back from Bodhgaya and said, they're giving this meditation retreat in Bodhgaya. If you're interested in meditation, you should go. So I hopped on the train and I went to Bodhgaya. I went to the Root Institute. I was waiting in line. I was the very last person in line. I don't remember how many people they took, say 25 people or 30 people. And I was number 31. They're like, sorry, registration's closed, the course is full. But they said you could stay here if you wish. We do have lodging, but there's no space for you on the course. So I had a little kuti and I tried to practice by myself. And there were two monks running the course. One was a monk from the Thai forest tradition. He was a German monk. I believe his name was Venerable Stardust. And then there was this Tibetan monk, whose name is escaping me right now. His English name was Graham, but I can't remember his monastic name. And the monk gave me, I saw him walking after the meal, and I said, oh, I really want to join the course, but it was full. Can you give me some instruction? So he just said very easily, just follow your breath. Pay attention to the inhalation and the exhalation, and whenever your mind wanders, just come back to that. So I said, okay. And I went to the Bodhi tree at the Mahabodhi temple, and I sat under the tree. And I was never able to sit for longer than 2 or 3 minutes. My mind was such a mess at the time. And I sat down and I closed my eyes. But before closing my eyes, I saw a guy in the distance, this man, a Western man with long hair, and he was sitting like a Buddha statue. And I said, one day I want to sit like that guy. And I closed my eyes. There were 2 Tibetan ladies next to me. It was very quiet at the time, not like today. And I must have sat an hour and a half or 2 hours. I couldn't believe it. It was such a powerful place. And I opened my eyes, and sure enough, that Western man was sitting there. And so I went back to my little kuti at the Root Institute and tried to practice, but didn't have much success after that. It was sort of beginner's luck that first time that got me into a concentrated state. And so several months later, I'm in Dharamsala and I meet this Tibetan monk. He's also at the Losar teachings. And I really ask him, I say, please, can you teach me meditation? Teach me meditation. So he says, okay, come to my room at such and such an hour. So I go, we sit down, and he offers me tea and we talk. And he was from Canada. He also went to McGill University. And so we just talked. And after about a half an hour, he said, oh, my time is up. I got to go. So I didn't get much instruction. I saw him again the next day. I said, oh, we didn't get to sit. Can you please teach me meditation? He said, sure, come to my apartment. When I went to his apartment, his room. When I went to his room that following day, he had just received the horrible news that the Dalai Lama's tutor had been assassinated. It was really horrible. And this tutor of the Dalai Lama's was this monk's primary teacher. And he was just a wreck. So he was in no shape to teach me. But he said, you know what? Why don't you go do one of these Vipassana courses, these 10-day Vipassana courses? So I said, okay. And I couldn't do it at that moment because I had to go back and continue my studies. And then I had some friends come and my mother came to India and we traveled. But so I made an appointment. I signed up, I registered to sit a course several months later. And I did that course, and that was in August 1997, and it was really a transformative and very memorable moment in my life.
How so? What do you remember about that course?
I just felt like I was at home and at peace. Like I sat in the cushion, everything seemed familiar. The chanting, even though it was the first time I heard Goenkaji's voice, it sounded familiar, it resonated. It seemed protective. I just felt at ease. And I hadn't felt that at ease in a long time. Traveling in India, it was, although great, it wasn't always easy. And just going here and there and wandering around, which was fun. It was a great experience. But at that moment, I didn't want to move around anymore. I needed a place to be a little bit more stable, and then going to the center was like, this is a place I'd like to be. And so I sat that course, and then I got to stay a little bit and serve another course, and then go to Dhamma Giri and sit at my second course. And Goenka was actually there for that second course, which was also a very rare and precious opportunity to see the teacher live and to meditate in his presence. So yeah, it was just, I guess, what was really special and what stands out in my memory is just how much at ease I was and how familiar everything felt.
Right. That's nice to hear. And so then,
Yeah.
how did your spiritual path develop after that? You mentioned you served again in Dharamsala. You went to Dhamma Giri. So I mean, you're in India taking your first course and getting just diving right into the Indian Goenka Vipassana community with serving and sitting, meeting old students and teachers and
Yeah. Yeah.
residents and such. And you're already somewhat familiar with India, having gone there at that time and that young age. And so from that point, how did you get more deeply involved in that community and practice?
So I came back to Canada to finish my undergraduate degree. Um, and in that year, I would there was a weekly group sitting in Montreal, but at McGill, in the Faculty of Religious Studies, there were two Buddhist studies professors who led morning meditations every day. There was one teacher who did mostly Anapana-based work. He practiced in the Theravada / Western Buddhist order tradition, and the other was a Zen monk. And so I meditated with them every morning. And so, although like I felt Vipassana, the Goenka tradition was my tradition, I still was very much inspired by these other teachers, these university professors, and these are the people I was with on a daily basis. So I was sitting with them every day, and then at that summer, I sat a course and served a course at a non-center site in Quebec. And then the following semester at university, I just continued sitting at university and doing the weekly group sittings. And then I graduated. And after I graduated, I spent about a year and a half at the different centers. So I spent overall maybe 5 months at Damodara in Massachusetts. Then the Quebec Center had just opened in Sutton. It's at a new location in Montebello now, but I spent maybe a month and a half there. I spent 3 or 4 months at Dhamma Mahavana in California, near Yosemite National Park. And so I just spent that year and a half going from center to center, sitting and serving, and making great friends, Dhamma brothers, Dhamma sisters. And there was one person in particular who I really connected with. And we met on and off in that time, traveling around the US together. And when we weren't sitting or serving, we would go on these long 8 or 10 day hikes, either in the Appalachian Mountains or in Utah, Colorado. And we would practice in nature. And so that was also a really formative time for me. And then right at the very end of that year, I was going to start a master's degree in Buddhist studies at McGill University. And at that end of year, so almost a year and a half of sitting and serving, I thought, okay, I'm going back to Montreal. I'm going to settle down. I'm ready to meet my Dhamma partner. This was on a 10-day course, my last 10-day course of that stint. And right after that 10-day course, Goenkaji was there for a science and spirituality conference. There were a few different speakers. And I told myself at the end of that course, okay, now I'm ready to meet my partner. And lo and behold, it's Metta Day. And there's a lot of people at the center because Goenkaji just arrived as well. He had given the final Metta instructions of the course. And I saw a friend who said to me, "Oh, I just served a course in Quebec with this young woman named Michelle. You should really meet her. She's just standing over there in the corner." And I turned my head and I looked at her and I said, "Oh, that's my wife." And then we met, and sure enough, like what is it, 22, 23 years later, we're still together.
Mm.
And so in that time, we've been a great support for each other. Sitting and serving together a lot, especially before we had children. And then we'd gone to India together. We did the 1 year Pali program at Dhamma Giri, where we studied Pali and did a lot of service and meditation. And then after we did that Pali program, we spent a lot of time traveling, and that's when we decided to write the book called Along the Path, The Meditator's Companion to the Buddha's Land. And
right. So before getting to that that book, to set the book up, because in order to write a book that becomes a guide for meditators going to India, you have to have quite a bit of experience and expertise in those places. And so you finished up your schooling in Canada and spent some time going to the centers and courses in North America and meet your future wife. And then you mentioned how the future from that point holds quite a bit of time in primarily India, but also Burma. Can you share a bit about what you were doing during those years, how you benefited from it, what you learned, and certainly the meditative aspect and the experience of being in the Goenka Vipassana community, but also the experience of being in those cultures, of being in Indian and Burmese cultures, which are those, even within the Goenka organization, the Goenka community and organization, those geographical regions have their own type of culture and relations that one can learn from and grow from. So what were those experiences in those years that you spent in those places? What were you doing, and how did you learn and benefit from it?
Sure. So that first year, we were mostly at Dhamma Giri, doing the Pali program, although Michelle and I did go for a month-long course at Dhamma Sindhu in Kutch, on the west coast of India. And then right after that course, we flew to Kolkata and then on to Myanmar. And that's when I think Goenkaji had done 3 big pilgrimages throughout the Golden Land with meditators. So this was the second one. I think it was the largest one. There were about 500 people. And so we spent a month in Myanmar doing that tour and visiting all the places and meditating, doing a course at Dhamma Jyoti. And we continued our Pali program. And then from there, we went up to Nepal. We spent some months over there. We sat another long course, and we did a lot of hiking through the Himalayas. And it was just an exciting time. Michelle and I spent about 2.5 years continuous in India, Nepal, and Myanmar, constantly going from one country, mostly Nepal and India, actually. We only went to Myanmar during that one pilgrimage, so it was mostly India and Nepal back and forth. And one beautiful thing at the time was the community. There were just a lot of young meditators, travelers like us, who were just sitting and serving. And this was such a great inspiration. We would meet each other at different centers. And even when we weren't at centers, if we were doing, spending time doing yoga or trekking, we would always meet other friends who would participate in these activities. So it was such a special time when you're in your early 20s, and all you have to worry about is what's on your back and where you're going to get your next meal, and but in a real privileged way, not in a way where life has forced us into a terrible situation, right? We were free, and by our own, it was really our own volition to live in that way. So we felt very monastic-like in that sense, very monk or yogi-like. We hardly had any worldly responsibilities, and we were able to get by with a little bit of money in our pocket and make it go for a very long way. And actually, during that time, it was actually right after we came back from the pilgrimage in Myanmar with 500 people, we saw that a lot of people just didn't know how to behave with the local culture in an appropriate way. Not to say we were experts. We were. I mean, maybe we were so-called experts in traveling, in other countries. We had traveled. I traveled all over North America. My wife had traveled all over Europe. Together, we had been all over India for quite a number of times, Nepal. And so even though it was my first time in Myanmar, I felt like and maybe it was also my training in anthropology, there was a certain sensitivity on how to engage with a local culture. And we just found that a lot of people didn't. There was just a lot of inappropriate behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a small group of us who thought, hey, we should put together a little guide for meditators. So as we were traveling and speaking with local people, we had we made quite a few local Burmese friends during that yatra, during that pilgrimage. And we were just asking them, okay, what's the right thing to do in this situation or that situation? How do we address the monks, the nuns, etc., things like that. And we were taking notes and thought, you know what, we'll put it, this would be a great service. We're going to put out a little booklet for meditators who are going to Myanmar.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, you did a way better job on that than.
Well, we'll get to that later.
Yeah. Our booklet would have been maybe 5 pages or 10 pages. It was really just the basics.
Right.
Anyways, so we head back to Dhamma Giri to continue the Pali program. And we're at that moment, I think a 45-day course had just ended, and we were sitting with Paul and Susan Fleischman, and we were chatting, we're talking, and Karl Franz comes to join us. I don't know if you know who Karl is. Do you know Karl Franz?
I don't.
Okay, so Karl Franz is also a travel writer.
Oh.
Him and his wife, Lorena, they wrote the book called The People's Guide to Mexico. It's probably in its 14th or 15th edition by now. It's sold, over 1 million copies. This is the ultimate travel guide. And so if you don't know it, you definitely need to get yourself a copy. And so they work as tour guides in Mexico. They work as tour guides and they write articles and they put together this, in my opinion, is probably the greatest travel guide ever written. And so Paul and Susan introduced us to Karl, and we were chatting. And then some Burmese fellow comes and joins us. I don't know who he was, but they knew him. He was a senior AT or maybe an Acharya from Dhamma but whose name I don't recall his name. And he says, Karl, when are you going to write a book about Burma? And he said, well, I don't know anything about Burma. And he says, well, what about India? We want, us Burmese meditators, we want to travel around India, but there's no good guide. Are you going to write a guide about India? And he said, India? I said, all I know is Dhamma Giri. So Paul turns to us and he says, why don't you guys write the book? You have some experience. And in our innocence or naivety or stupidity, we're like, sure, that sounds like a good idea.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. And then we spent the next 7 years working on this book.
Yeah. Wow.
And it was great having Karl as an advisor at first. I sent him some early drafts of some early chapters, and he said, "This is just terrible.
Oh no,
this is terrible work. Nobody's going to want to read it. It's not publishable."
Yeah.
And rather than getting defeated and depressed, feeling defeated or depressed, I said, "Okay, let's just keep working on it." And he sent us a copy of his book because we didn't have a copy, and we're like, okay, this is a great approach. So actually, the entire first section of our book, the first 100 pages or so, are really derive all its inspiration from A People's Guide to Mexico. And then from there, we just spent a lot of time going to the different pilgrimage sites. In all manner of, sometimes we went in private vehicles, but we also did it. We hitchhiked, we went by train, we took local buses. We wanted to really experience pilgrimage in all its different forms and possibilities. And we spent a long time just going back and forth to these sites. And then sometimes in Bodhgaya, sometimes we'd spend, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months over there working on the book. And then it was a long process. And then once our time was up, we returned to Canada, and I started a PhD in the anthropology of religion at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And around that same time, I started teaching part-time in the humanities department at Champlain College. And our son was born. And we bought our first property. And actually, a couple of years later, we bought our first property.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have so many thoughts going in different directions with all the things you mentioned about the process of guidebook writing, about different cultures interfacing, about taking on a project of that scale. I'm not sure where to go with all of them. I guess the thing that stands out first and foremost is looking away from the actual guidebook process itself, which I want to come back to, but looking at it from the angle of a Westerner who is in a land that is the origin of the Buddhist teachings, where everything spread from there, and trying to make it more accessible. I don't know how much you've thought about this, and I'd be curious to know, but I mean, your book stands in a historical line of the last several hundred years of Western travelers, colonial administrators, spiritual seekers that are trying to uncover in greater and greater detail who was the spiritual figure? What did he teach? Where did he teach it? And how can we understand this in our language, in our context and culture? I don't know if you've heard of the great book, In Search of the Buddha. I can't remember the author offhand, but it's
Charles Allen.
Right.
Charles Allen.
It's an amazing book that describes mainly the British colonial administration, some other Westerners there as well, who are trying to understand decade after decade who the Buddha actually was and what he taught. And because they're undercover, they're digging up archaeological remains, and they're trying to piece together teachings and translations. And every generation of colonial administrators just puts together this puzzle a bit more to try to understand. You know, back in those days, there's no Wikipedia, there's no book no encyclopedia you can get off the shelf. There's no access to this information, and it's amazing to think of that time, really not so long ago, that people in all of our countries and cultures did not know anything about who this figure was or what he taught, and they're trying to put it together and make it more accessible, just put the building blocks together. And of course, in the 19th century, that with Orientalists and others, in the Polytech Society, there's work that they're doing that is trying to bring these teachings more and more and make them more accessible. And your book is very much in that line of a Westerner coming to an origin site of these teachings and carrying on that step a bit further. So before your book is written, and we should mention, I haven't done this up to this point, the name of your book is Along the Path. So that's something that listeners should definitely check out. That's what we're constantly referring to here, is the book Along the Path. That before Along the Path comes out, there are hordes of Western and as well as Asian visitors that are coming, and obviously around the world as well, but mainly from those regions, that are coming to these sacred Buddhist sites in India, trying to understand, okay, what happened here and why is it meaningful and what do I have to go see, and as well as how should I act. And there's a lot of scattered information to try to piece this together and understand, but there's no, online and from fellow travelers that have come before and written notes from various books pieced together. But there's nothing there. There's not just one text that's just like, this is where I should go, and this is what happened here. This is what to think about, and this is the specific sites in this region to see, and this is the history of what we know about what happened here. It's another step in that historical line dating back centuries to make this more accessible and understandable, and really even possible for people to come and have an experience. And so I'm wondering if, like, in your process of writing and publishing and everything else, if you ever saw yourself in line with some of these historical events and academic attempts before, that you were building one more step in that progression.
Not really. Although now that you say it, I could see that, but I didn't have that awareness or consciousness or even intention at the time. Although I was very much aware of the work of the Orientalists, and we do acknowledge how much they've contributed to the discovery of these sites. These people, Alexander Cunningham and William Pepe and all these other Orientalists, these administrators, Buchanan and Princep, all these guys, they were following the 7th century monks. His name Xuanzang. They were following Xuanzang's travelogue in finding all these places. So these guys had, very little to go on besides the 7th century text.
This is a Chinese pilgrim, we should say, right?
Yes, the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang. I think he was in India for about, 15 or 20 years, around 625 to 640, around that time. I don't remember the exact dates. And so they were following his work to discover all these places, because this monk went from place to place to place. He eventually settled down for some time to learn and then teach at Nalanda University in Nalanda. So it's quite incredible. At the same time, these Orientalists, they were these European colonial administrators. It's debatable whether they should have, been there and had that much power in the first place. But besides that, without getting too much into the critical side of things, I can say that I really appreciate all the work that they did, because without all their efforts, that they had so much responsibilities. They were building roads and building bridges and managing finances and managing political conflicts. These guys worked from early morning till late at night, and then whatever free moment they had, they would spend doing this archaeological work, which was really incredible. These people were so talented because, some of them had military training, and they had political training and training in economics, and they knew so many languages.
Right.
I think James Princep knew something like 20 different languages, which is just incredible. And then they were drawing. There were no cameras back then, so they're drawing everything. If you look at some of their artwork, it's just unbelievable. So these were very multi-talented people. And then, even though they weren't Buddhist or practitioners of the Dhamma, they were still very sympathetic. And for some of them, I'm sure it went beyond just intellectual curiosity. I think philosophically or spiritually, something must have connected with them. Something must have resonated, which is why they did all this work. And yeah, you're right. So, but beyond their work, there wasn't too much out there when we decided to write our book. There was Middle Land, Middle Way by Venerable Shravasti Dhammika, which was a very good book, and that helped us, and we used it. But it's a very thin book, and there are some references to the Pali Canon, and it's very much rooted in history. But as a travel guide itself, there were some features lacking, especially for people who wanted to really connect the teachings of the Buddha to the places themselves. So I really liked the book, but we thought, okay, I think we can build on this book. We can use this book, Middle Land, Middle Way, as a stepping stone for our work. And our work, it took a very long time, and we definitely didn't do it alone. We had so many people contributing, sending us information about new places that we hadn't even heard of, or different ways in which you can travel, and different hotels and accommodations, and references to different texts and things like that. So, and then we had lots of people who helped with the editing and the artwork and the layout and the graphic design. And there was a lot of people who had their fingers in the pie, we can say. So I'm very grateful to all those people, and very grateful to the people who gave us time and space to write. That was a really interesting process. Sometime in Dharamsala, there was one place, this family that we became quite close with, and we would just stay with them for 3 months we did that maybe 3 or 4 times and just used our room as a writing space. Incidentally, the book Jesus Lived in India was also written in the same
Oh,
room
wow.
that we wrote along the path in.
Amazing.
Yeah, and a lot of time in Bodhgaya, staying in different monasteries, and we're just really fortunate to have good spaces. So there's a lot of people involved, and we published the book. I think the first edition came out around 2009. 2009, 2009, I think it was. Shortly after our daughter was born, and I was working on my PhD at the same time. And I thought, okay, I really like, this book is an important book, but it's really just written for practitioners.
Mhm.
And the more I went back to India and Bodhgaya, I thought, and I did my PhD research in Bodhgaya on a completely different subject. It was looking at how modern Western pilgrims, or how some modern Western pilgrims, are engaging with local charitable projects such as opening schools or working at schools or clinics, vocational training centers, things like that. And so I was writing along, we were writing along the path on the one hand, and at the same time, I'm doing all this critical academic work. And so shortly after we published the book, I kept working on the PhD and did the research, and we lived in Bodhgaya for 9 months. And going to a place like Bodhgaya for a few days or a couple of weeks gives you one kind of perspective.
Sure,
But then when
sure.
you start to spend months on end in a place, then you see all the nuance and complexity
Right.
and local politics and relationships between pilgrims, foreign pilgrims, and who are mostly Buddhist or sympathetic to Buddhism, and local Muslims and Hindus. The place
Mhm.
becomes much more complex.
Mhm.
And so my PhD thesis, which is called Buddhists Without Borders, Transnational Pilgrimage, Social Engagement, and Education in Bodhgaya, this is a completely different work, and it required
Oh, wow.
a completely different kind of mind
Mhm.
than writing this pilgrimage guide. So the pilgrimage guide is very straightforward. This happened here, and to get to this place, you take this bus and that train, and you
Right.
can go eat at that restaurant, etc. But doing critical academic work
Uh-huh.
was much more challenging and more complex, and so it allowed for a lot more nuanced understanding of these places. So, just to come back to the question, did I ever see myself, as a continuation, or as somebody continuing the work of these academics or these Orientalists? Yes and no. I mean, it's just a completely different time, a completely different setting. I'm a completely different person with completely different background and upbringing.
Mhm.
But as you ask the question, I think, okay, well, maybe I do have a place in the long line of mostly Western scholars who are looking at these places along the Buddhist circuit in India.
Right. One of the things I'm thinking is you contrast that thesis with the guide you did, because really you're talking about a contrast where you're looking at the same thing in the same place, but in one regard you're looking more reverentially and trying to aid in the spiritual access and appreciation of those that are making this journey. And on the other, you're being, as you said, critical. You're being very you're looking at it very, very hard and asking difficult questions and telling the story as it really comes out. And I'm wondering if those two worlds ever conflicted and caused a kind of what would be the word, cause some confusion in you, or some hesitation how to deal with it. And one of the reasons I'm asking that is, I mean, of course, there's so much for us to talk to in terms of our respective projects of the guidebook that you wrote in India for meditators, and the one that I worked on in Burma, and there's various stages of that work's completion. But in regarding this particular point, this is definitely something I faced, is starting to write a book with only a guide, I should say. I like that term better than a book, because that was the intention at the time. Having an intention to write a guide that was reflecting the deeper appreciation and knowledge that I had of certain Burmese Buddhist sites that I saw meditators and pilgrims, foreigners coming in, that were trying to figure everything out. That, I was a few years ahead of my head was a few years above the water, you could say, from where they were at, and wanting to bring a more reverential and appreciative and informed understanding of these things. And certainly, as I went about that, many cases that happened, and really tracking down, well, Webu Sayed, he this is the reason why he came here, and this is where he slept, and this anecdote happened on this day, and this person has written this, and just starting to collect all of these stories and translations, recollections, as well as physical, attaching them in many cases to physical places. This is where this thing happened. That really no one, I think, outside of Myanmar had really ever heard before, and that part was really exciting. And to this day, it's still exciting to know that some of those stories and knowledge I've helped to put into the world and bring a deeper appreciation and understanding. At the same time, that I also learned about the more difficult underlying underbelly of some of these things, that it's not how it seems, and that sometimes the reverential is happening as a layer simultaneous to something that is far more unpleasant, but not seen or talked about. Sometimes the reverential is not actually true, and it's it appears to be so, but as you see what it really is, it's really somehow a facade. In other cases, it's the story definitely exists, but it's far more complicated, and there's far more nuance to have to untangle and figure out and see the consequences of different kinds of actions and events than meets the eye. And so it was, as I was personally going through collecting and telling these stories, this conflict started to take on a greater and greater role in terms of who I was and what I wanted to express, and how to be where my boundaries were, and yet to also be honest. And I think, honestly, my complexity was, my guess is it might have been a bit more complicated than yours. Not to in any way underestimate what you uncovered, but by the fact that Burma is such a living and thriving Buddhist community, and where Bodhgaya is living and thriving in some ways, it also has a past which in some ways is finite. We might never get to the end of that finiteness, but at least we know that these things happened. Whereas in Burma, it's constantly evolving. There's no one who knows everything that's going on in terms of the spiritual traditions in Burma. The most scholarly books start by acknowledging how little is known and how segmented and narrow their focus is, and with in regards to everything else that's happening there. And there's reasons for that. Obviously, the closed nature of the country, which is another aspect that differs, that makes these work differ, is the openness in being able to do it. But in any case, in Burma, the difficulty of starting to learn these greater complexities and to balance that with the reverential intention that had started it, and that was still there in some ways, it was just a lot more complicated. It brought up a lot of questions and confusions that had to be worked out. So I'm wondering, for you, I mean, you wrote 2 different books, so maybe in some ways, maybe that helped to be able to say, this mind is writing this and this mind is writing that. But I'm just wondering if you ever felt like you were holding contradictions or confusions or uncomfortable intersections or not, or maybe it was just very straightforward that this is for this and this is for that.
To begin, I think you're right. Myanmar the situation in Myanmar is way more complex, and I think I pointed that out, really early on in our relationship when we first started, chatting about your book especially, and after that first pilgrimage to Myanmar, is that there's so many traditions. There's so many living traditions. When you look at India, for example, you want to learn meditation, it's pretty much Vipassana as taught by S.N. Goenka or nothing. Sure, I mean, there are a few Western teachers who come and lead the occasional annual retreat, like Christopher Titmuss or some other people. But in general, in India, if you want to learn meditation, you're going to learn this one kind of practice. Whereas in Myanmar, there's hundreds and hundreds of masters and traditions, and so it's like you have this whole buffet that you can choose from. And obviously, when you mix in with the long cultural tradition and you mix in the political tensions and conflicts, it's just a very different story, because it's so much more dynamic and alive. Where when you go to the pilgrimage circuit in India, sure, yes, on the one hand, yes, you only have the centers and practices taught by Goenka, but also these places have only been recently discovered within the last century or so, and the local population isn't Buddhist either. It's all Hindu and some Muslim. And so all the places that are popping up are really popping up, like the Buddhist places I'm saying, are really popping up purely for pilgrimage or religious touristic purposes. And so it has its own set of complexities, but not nearly the same as what you experience in Myanmar. It's almost like the whole country is just filled with mini pilgrimage routes, whereas in India is just this one main route. And to come to the question, have I felt a tension or a disjuncture between my spiritual work and my academic work? Yeah, at times. It's very difficult in the academy to declare yourself as a practitioner. I think it's easier if you're, let's say, a rabbi and you're studying Jewish studies, it's permitted. Or you're a minister and you're teaching Christianity at university or theology, it's accepted. If you're a practicing Muslim and you're teaching in the university, it's accepted. But as soon as you're a quote unquote convert, as a Buddhist or a Hindu yogi or a Sufi mystic or anything like this, it's not really, it's frowned upon. And so a lot of people who are in, and this is obviously changing, but when I was doing my PhD, it wasn't really, it was kind of frowned upon. And then, so in terms of the work that I write about this in my PhD dissertation, and I never published the dissertation as a whole, but I've published maybe 5 or 6 chapters. Pretty much every chapter has been published in different journals and books, academic books. And there is quite a bit of a postmodern reflection in that work, where I try to be honest and say, well, this is my spiritual practice, this is my intellectual history, this is my ethnicity, this is my family life, this is the way I see things, and I acknowledge that all of this is going to color the way I'm framing my questions and interpreting my data. So I think it's really important to be honest. And I think that goes, on both sides, even in spiritual practice, to avoid spiritual bypass and avoiding what's really happening and avoiding the tough questions, all in the name of meditation, is problematic. And I feel like my academic work, my critical academic work, has helped me shed light on my biases, on my opinions, even on some of my shadows. Like through that reflective process really brought a lot of these things to light, and I was able to use them as tools or objects of investigation in my meditation practice, my contemplative practice. And then on the flip side, I feel like the meditation really helped me ground myself in my practice and helped me frame questions that were useful, and they were going to be useful and helpful for other people, whether they're meditators or other academics or people who were involved in philanthropy or going to work in some kind of charitable project or start up a charitable project. I really tried to make my research. I came to my research from the perspective as an engaged academic. It wasn't just critical analysis for the sake of critical analysis. I really wanted it to be useful in some sense. And I feel like my meditation practice really helped me do that. And my meditation practice also helped me I feel very more open-minded when I was interviewing people. Sometimes when we get stuck not stuck, but when we stay involved with just a single tradition, our thinking can get narrow, no matter what the tradition is. I think this is true for practitioners of almost any tradition. When you're only hearing one type of discourse, your mind tends to think that way, and it becomes very easy to be judgmental of other practices and traditions. And so I feel like a lot of so maybe this is more of the academic work helping my spiritual practice. The academic work really promoted a sense of open-mindedness. And I maybe the meditation practice really helped me embody that open-mindedness. And because there was a lot of investigation of my own mind, I could see, there's bias here. There's judgment here. I have look at these prejudices coming up. Oh, look at these preferences coming up. What's going on there? So it helped me with the questioning. So it was really like a back and forth in the process. The thesis itself and the articles, the ensuing articles, I felt gave me a lot of perspective on Bodhgaya, especially because the thesis was really about Bodhgaya, not so much the whole pilgrimage circuit. It was really about Bodhgaya. And when I would be bringing groups, and we can come back to this later, but when I started bringing groups with Pariyatti in 2013, I believe, to these sites, right away, I submitted my dissertation. I finished my PhD in 2012, and then in 2013, I led my first group to along the Buddhist circuit to all these sacred Dhamma sites. And especially when I was in Bodhgaya, where I knew so many people. I knew all the local hawkers, and I knew the street kids, and I knew all the restaurant owners, and I knew all the scam artists and the thieves, and and people involved in the various social organizations. Like I really knew a lot of people there. And I knew a lot of what was going on. A lot of the work that was going on was very kosher, but there was also a lot of sketchy things happening. And so I constantly had to make decisions what to share with the group, right? Do I want to share the whole picture? And if I do share that whole picture, what purpose is that going to serve? People are coming for a meditative experience. They're only here for a few days. So in 5 days, they can only receive a little bit of information, not a lot of information, especially on that level. So I would really limit where I took places and the things I said to things that were directly connected to meditation and the spiritual life. But I also allowed people the opportunity if they wanted to ask questions privately or after the pilgrimage, if they wanted to have, other kinds of discussions, I kept that open. And I did, for people who were interested, I sent them, a link to my dissertation if they wanted to have more information. So some people were interested in that side of things, and other people weren't. And that's kind of the beauty of pilgrimage. Because when we travel to these sacred places, often as an act of spiritual devotion, there's multiple meanings. People have different sets of expectations. People have different reasons why they're going. People have different interpretations, and they're attracted to different things. And so some people were just really interested. Oh, I just want to do this. I just want to go to the Bodhi tree and a couple of other sites and just meditate. Other people wanted to visit schools and clinics and other charitable institutions. So sometimes I would be able to direct them in that direction as well. And so I found, although I had a certain trajectory for the pilgrimage, I always left doors open for small tangents if people wanted to go in that direction or have a little side journey.
Yeah, and it's bringing up memories of the Pariyati pilgrimage we did together in Burma.
Yeah.
And I believe I remember you saying during that, definitely someone said this to me. If not you, it was someone else. But it was a comment that it was a realization that when you do a pilgrimage in India, you are really the master of your group. And if you want it to be a Thai forest tradition pilgrimage, or a Goenka pilgrimage, or a Zen Buddhist pilgrimage, or a New Age whatever pilgrimage, if it's a bunch of traditional Sri Lankans, whatever your group is, because you're visiting sites of history, you can really keep the vibe and the discourse and the methodology of your group alive and consistent, while you're also interacting with these sites from the past. But in Burma, you cannot. And that was a realization from that pilgrimage. And what was so interesting was, even in that Burma pilgrimage, we were besides for big sites like Shwedagon or Mahamuni, the Burma pilgrimage was pretty much limited to sites within the Goenka lineage, the principal teachers of Sayaju Baken, Sayataji, Wabu Sayadaw, and Lady Sayadaw. However, based on the work I had done at that time and uncovering a lot of not just sites where those principal teachers had lived and taught, but also sites connected with other offshoots of those lineages, and in an effort to try to understand those teachers to a greater extent. And because every site we were going to was a part of the fabric, the living fabric of the dynamic Burmese Buddhist society, which was alive in the moment, as well as representing the trajectory of the years before that had led to that moment, it led to, one can say, some confusing encounters of having to negotiate how you take an insular discourse and an internal understanding into a very alive culture, where those figures and sites are still existing, but they're not existing within that insular narrative that everyone talks about. They're existing within a Burmese Buddhist narrative and context and culture and people, and how to have that conversation, how to go with an appreciation for what one has been told and what one has reverence for, and to see it in an environment where there's things that one hasn't been trained for and even has aversion or suspicion about, with things that seem quote unquote religious or Buddhist, that a Western practitioner has prided themselves on being secular and not taking these on. I think one of the most vivid examples of that, which I've heard this anecdote repeated, I think this has kind of gotten some wings, and I don't even know how it's how it started to be shared and spread, but I've heard this over the years from different places, and it was something I experienced where we took I don't think this was the one you were on, I think it was a subsequent one. We took a group to Hansawadi Monastery in Yangon. This was a place I had found was established by a monk who had learned under Sayathaji, who was the teacher of U Ba Khin. And Hansawadi Monastery was the first practice site of a Sayathaji disciple. So it was quite an important place to visit. It was established in the waning days of World War II, and it was a monk who was teaching Sayathaji's technique. And when we came, because this was so off the radar, and I had just discovered it recently, no foreigners had ever made their way there. And when he realized who we were and what lineage we came from, what background, he just welcomed us with open arms and did a group meditation together and gave us all kinds of treats and snacks, and just kept proclaiming, you're my long lost relatives. Like we found each other again, and just so much excitement and enthusiasm. And as he was giving this kind of joyous remark, he said, we have courses a couple times a month, and it'd be so wonderful to have you here. And, please, it's so great that we're reacquainted again and that we come from the same lineage. Please come and take my courses. And as the students filed back on the bus, a teacher stood up and said, anyone who takes those courses will be disqualified from long courses and face the consequences of the organizational rules and such. And so there was no greater dichotomy than that moment, which represented both the joy and the reverence of connection, as well as the confusion and negotiation of an insular culture meeting a living, vibrant culture, and society, which doesn't happen in India. Another of the things I've remarked on a number of times, which I think is just a fascinating and very troubling incident to reflect on in terms of what it's meaning, is that Sayagyi U Ba Khin, who is the teacher of Goenka, the way that he was able to start his teaching career was that U Nu, which was the president at the time, he made the very controversial decision to proclaim Buddhism as the state religion. The result of that decision started the Kachin rebellion. The Kachins, who were Christian, decided to break away from the Union and rebel from their disgust that they were going to be living in a state that was not going to give the same preferences to their religion and was going to mandate another state religion. Because of that state mandate, Sayagyi U Ba Khin, who was a government minister, was allowed in his government office to have a Buddhist shrine, not just to have a Buddhist shrine, but to bring speakers, to give discourses, to encourage following the precepts, to give short Anapana instructions. And indeed, before IMC was developed, the first meditation instructions happened inside a government office by his own clerks, who were encouraged to attend. For many Western meditators who are, quite progressive and hold quite liberal values and a strong adherence in church and state, and when we would see incidences today in our countries of living in a Christian majority country, of trying to make Christian incursions into curriculum or government service or state buildings or whatnot, we're righteously incensed that this would happen. And yet, as we go back and trace the history of IMC and U Ba Khin, we are beneficiaries of a state mandate that was giving preferential treatment to Buddhism and providing numerous state resources to propping it up, which was hurting and harming all the other non-Buddhist peoples in Myanmar, to the extent that it actually caused a rebellion that hasn't been quashed to this day. And so that's just another example of how do you take this? How do you, when you learn this complicated history, and you have, on one hand, holding this great reverence for what U Ba Khin was able to do, and how that, for those people in the Goenka lineage and Goenka students, to realize that U Ba Khin's actions was what allowed them to get a Dhamma that transformed their lives, and how valuable that is. But then balancing that with why Ubakin was able to do this, and this complicated history, and the complicated history of Buddhist nationalism and anti-Muslim sentiments and anti-foreign sentiments. I mean, the Muslim or the Indian and Chinese populations that were there, and on and on. I think one can easily say, well, I'm just a Western practitioner and this doesn't concern me. This is politics. I don't need to know about this. And yet also, that's not really fair to say if you have reverence for what Sayagyi Ubakin did, and yet you want to close off the part of the mind that is the history of how he was able to do it. This all becomes just very, very complicated. So I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you right now. I think I've given you 3 different connected anecdotes. I'm not even going to ask a question. I'll just leave my ramblings there and pick up from anything that I said.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot to chew on there. I don't have really the historical knowledge to comment what the impacts of the president or prime minister making Buddhism the state religion. So I'm going to shy away from making any comment because I don't have enough knowledge about that. But one thing I will say, I do remember reading little pamphlets little pamphlets put out by Ubakin that when he was offering these courses, he was also offering them to non-Buddhists. And he made a point to say these are open to, I think, Christians and Muslims and Hindus, if I remember correctly. So he was trying to bring in people from all backgrounds, all traditions, and emphasize the universality of the practice that he was teaching, at least at the basic level. So I don't know if he was, conscious of he must have been conscious of the privilege that Buddhists had. And so he was trying to smooth that over by bringing everybody or making his courses or his classes or his sessions available to everybody. I'm just taking a guess here. I don't really know. Yeah, I feel like sometimes looking at these different situations through a theoretical framework can be helpful. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Victor Turner. So he writes an anthropological analysis of pilgrimage using these different concepts, which he calls liminality and communitas. And I feel this is very helpful to understand the process of pilgrimage and in a straightforward way versus ways that get very complicated. So Victor Turner's approach to pilgrimage was very straightforward. Basically, he says all pilgrims go through some sort of initiation, purification, and then a transformation. And the liminality that he talks about refers to the condition of the pilgrim who leaves his or her mundane world, who leaves his or her structured life, and enters into a world of anti-structure, which he calls betwixt and between. And in these incidents, all social roles dissolve, and everybody becomes marginalized, socially marginalized, geographically marginalized. And when that happens, it creates a bond, like which he called communitas. And all these qualities of pilgrims, all these qualities sort of mix together, and they become a homogeneous group, which allows for a sense of egalitarianism and comradeship, and even a sense of sacredness, because all classes and castes are temporarily suspended. So this is an attitude I often see on the pilgrimages in India. Okay, like people are coming from all over. I remember that first pilgrimage I did, there was maybe 30 people from about a dozen different countries. And there was a lot of senior teachers, acharyas, assistant teachers, and a handful of people who weren't assistant teachers. But all those roles and all those titles disappeared. And we all went through this process where, we were initiated into the pilgrimage, and then there's the what Turner calls purification. So for me, this is all the going to different caves to meditate and having different discussions and doing 1-day courses, and all the stuff is coming up. And then afterwards, we're transformed in one way or another. And it's difficult to say how, but we do have some transformation that takes a long time to process, and we really feel it when we go home. And so this is a very standard way of looking at pilgrimage. Now, there's these scholars named John Eade and Michael Selno. I don't know if you're familiar with their work, but they wrote a very famous book in the early 90s called Contesting the Sacred. And they're critiquing Turner's work, because Turner had these preconceived ideals. And in their work, they said, well, it doesn't always, sometimes Turner's framework works, but there's always these diverse and discrepant instances that happen on pilgrimage, which kind of highlights what you were just talking about. And so when we only pay attention to the sort of collective mutual piety, in some ways that could be very accurate, but in other moments it could be misleading, because we all have these different cultural backgrounds. We have different political positions, which sometimes manifest in the crowd, as in the example you just gave. We have different expectations. We have different motivations. And these are often very different. Another example, we actually did go to that Hansarwadi meditation center on the first pilgrimage. We can come back to that later. But these divergent attitudes that I'm talking about, I don't know if you remember on the first pilgrimage, we were meditating a lot. And I remember one morning, I think we were going to Mahamuni Pagoda in Mandalay. And we said, okay, be ready for 8 o'clock after breakfast. We're going to the pagoda. And there were a couple of people who were like, more meditation? I'm sick of meditation. I just want to go jogging. And I don't know if you remember that, but there were a couple of people who decided to skip meditation and go jogging. And I know that bothered us at the time. And there was another person or two people, they were sick of pagodas and monasteries. They wanted to go visit different schools. I think one of these people is a school teacher, and she just wanted to visit schools. She was done visiting pagodas. And so, in a sense, I remember, we both of us and even Snow were a little bit disappointed. But upon further reflection, thinking about this idea of contesting the sacred and how all of us have different motivations, it really shows how these boundaries are constantly shifting. They're constantly moving. And instead of creating these generalizations, it's sometimes important to focus on the specifics, because there's not just a single specific discourse that is applicable at all times, but there's often these conflicting discourses. And so in Burma, in Myanmar, it's like there's all these different things going on.
Yeah.
And all the participants have different expectations and motivations and responsibilities. So I'm imagining, I wasn't there on that second pilgrimage, but I imagine if one of the leaders in the organization said something like that, maybe the person's, I don't know if you spoke to the person, and we don't have to get into that here, but, I'm hoping that the motivation was less sectarian and more just saying, just to let you know, these are the sort of rules. And there's a lot of people who want to sit long courses. And if you go and sit here, and there's nothing wrong in sitting in this place, but if you do a retreat in this sort of side branch tradition, then you'll probably have to wait your 2 years before you can do a long course in this tradition. So sometimes I'm wondering if it was just for information purposes rather than sort of authoritarian or sectarian positioning. I don't know. So I can't really say. But I guess my point is there's, and this is what's so interesting about pilgrimage, but also makes it really challenging for a pilgrimage leader, is there's all these different ways of seeing things. And I did, even though it's more straightforward in India. On the very first pilgrimage that I led, I had suggested that if people wanted on their own free time to go visit a particular Tibetan monastery, because the artwork was exquisite, like the tankas that were hanging, and just the walls and the columns just had all this beautiful, intricate Tibetan imagery and floral patterns and all this. It was really magnificent. And it wasn't part of our itinerary, and there was a lot of free time in Bodhgaya. And I said, well, if you want to, take a break from meditation, go check this place out. And there were, some acharyas on the tour who did go, and they just loved it. They said, wow, this is out of this world. This is some of the most beautiful artwork I've ever seen. And then on the other hand, there were, a couple of, very senior people who were like, oh, you shouldn't, tell people to go visit this place. It's not part of our tradition. It's not even within the Theravada world. So maybe you shouldn't be saying these things. So I was getting such different responses from such senior leaders in the organization, which goes to show it's like, human beings are so complicated and everything is so messy. And then when you put yourself in the position of a guide to these places, you need to navigate everybody's stuff. And so there's no easy answer.
Yeah, and I think my experience as a pilgrimage guide was a little short-lived, and my interest now is not so much. I mean, I'm definitely interested in the pilgrimage experience and very interested in hearing yours, but my personal question is not so much on how to lead a pilgrimage to those places. It's more, how do you hold this? How do you talk about it? And being between these worlds of a reverent practitioner base in the West that has benefited so much from this, and that hears the stories of their older teachers, or those teachers who transported the teachings to them, or their short time experience of actually being in those places and learning, and has their own internal framework and messaging and discourse about how they hold it. And then the things that they don't see, or they don't know, or they purposely avoid and bypass, and knowing where these come together, knowing how to acknowledge the existence of both of these in a way that doesn't undermine one or the other. And as you're talking, your story about encouraging the practitioners, the pilgrims, to go to the Tibetan monastery, that reminds me of when I was invited to go to Australia and New Zealand, and to Goenka centers, Goenka Vipassana centers specifically, and give some presentations about the research I was doing in Burma, the pilgrimages I was leading, and everything else. And I remember, and I spoke to the organizers of the different centers when I went, and tried I knew I was very conscious that I was a guest that was being invited into into one's own community, and whatever my background or views, like I wanted to be very sensitive in what I was able to talk about there, and not ruffling feathers or whatnot, as I was an invited guest and someone in this community. So I was careful with that, and received the answers from the people that were inviting me, and worked on the presentations according to those guidelines. And one of the things I found in giving some of those presentations, like, for example, let's just pick one, a couple-hour presentation on Lady Sayadaw's life and his sites, and talking about Lady Sayadaw in a bit more of a dynamic and flexible and open way of how he adapted the teachings, just how dynamic he was in his approach, how much he did, and some of those dynamic qualities of what he did and how he lived and how he taught. In some ways, they're not talked about in the discourse of the Goenka communities, and in other ways, they actually directly contradict what those discourses are. And so it's a very difficult balance to thread, but I tried to do so carefully, without really discussing the implications of it, but more just sticking with what I know as facts, and what I've seen, what I've heard, what I've understood. And after some of those presentations, the response, and this goes also to speak to your observation of how diverse these communities are, that they're not monolithic, that there's so many different intentions among the members of it. And I remember after one particular talk, I had one senior teacher come up to me almost in tears and say, like, this is the most important thing I ever heard. And she went on to describe how her husband was just not really falling in line with the course regulations and not really wanting to fit into that system, and she was just really distraught with this and really wanted him to be a regular course sitter and doing the 2 hours a day and everything else, and was causing tensions in their marriage. And she explained to me that hearing the dynamic qualities of Lady Sayadaw, he was not trying to fit everyone into some narrow space that everyone had to conform to, but was really working with who people were and how they can understand. It made her realize and reflect that she was really not behaving the right way to her husband, and that it was she was really trying to force him to be something that he didn't need to be or want to be, and that it wasn't black and white. It wasn't like you're a good Vipassana meditator and we're aligned, or you're outside and we're on different paths. And that talk gave her the insight and the ability to realize how she could be flexible and how she could adjust the way that she was relating and her expectations and everything else. And it just gave her this sense of liberation, like a weight being removed. Really lovely and beautiful to hear. And then there was another teacher, another practitioner, who had a very different reaction, and without going into specifics of it, basically wanted me out, wanted me silenced, wanted a retraction, and was just deeply offended that I was saying things that did not go directly according to the line of discourses, and in some ways even contradicted it, even though I was very careful not to discuss the implications or to highlight those. But just how can you avoid it when at Lady's birth monastery there is a building which translates from Pali into meaning walking meditation. It's a long it's not a hallway, but it's a when you see the building, you can realize why it was constructed for the purpose of walking meditation. And everyone there says this is where Lady Sayadaw did his walking meditation. And if in the Goenka discourses today, walking meditation is explicitly described as something that is not useful, and yet there's a building named Walking Meditation in Moniwa. What do you do with this? How do you present this knowledge and be comfortable with it? And so that diverse reaction, I think, speaks to also what you were saying of the different ways that people hold this and different intentions and so on.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess the question was, how do I hold these contradictions? Am I right? That's what you were asking in the beginning. And how I hold these contradictions is just by being aware that human beings are filled with contradictions, and that we change. Because, at one point early on when I was a meditator, well, I'm not in any position of leadership in the tradition, so I'm in a very different place than a lot of people, and have maybe a little bit more freedom. But I just, I am a teacher, a college teacher, and I have children, and I have neighbors, and I'm part of a community, and everybody has their own perspective. Whether their perspective is grounded in fact and evidence or not is another story. But just by, and this is a practice that whenever I'm encountering people, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and seeing people have all sorts of ideas about vaccinations and vaccination passports and the science behind it. There's just opinions were flying left, right, and center. And so I just try to recognize that we're all faulted human beings. If we're unenlightened, we are steeped in wrong view. And I just try to develop empathy and compassion for the views that are plaguing conflict. I used to be more reactive and try to fight against any view that didn't align with mine, or a view that I thought was, just completely false. But I recognize that usually has little impact and just creates more tension and even confusion. So like in that instance on the pilgrimage, I just smiled and said, okay. And then I'm just going to do what I think is right according to the position, the role that I've been given. And, incidentally, I also gave a talk at a center on Lady Sayadaw some years back. And I had two very similar reactions from two senior teachers. One was like, wow, I hadn't realized how open-minded and broad this person was, Lady Sayadaw was, and the teachings that he gave. And it's so inspiring that this person was just such a giant. And another person said, whether this stuff is true or not, it just shouldn't be talked about. And this is from two people who are seniors. And in both cases, I just said, okay, fine, like I'm going to speak what I think is important. But I'm at the same time, I'm not going to rock the boat too much if it doesn't serve much purpose. And if people are interested in hearing, the truth of a matter or hearing my perspective on the matter, whether it's wrong or right, then I'll be happy to share with them. But if I'm going to make some people uncomfortable and the majority of the people uncomfortable, then I'm just going to avoid saying that kind of thing, whether it's on a pilgrimage or in my community or in the classroom.
Yeah, that's skillful. That's well said.
Yeah.
I want to. Yeah, yeah. We've been talking about this kind of in collaboration with some of the other bigger themes and tensions that we've been exploring. But we got a little bit away from your trajectory that I want to go back to specifically. We were talking, we had led up to the point that we had talked in depth about this guidebook, this groundbreaking guidebook that you wrote along the path, which guides meditators and helps them in knowing what to see and what the value and importance is. And then you became a pilgrimage leader. And we've talked a bit about some of the incidences and a thematic way of the pilgrimages that you led and what stood out. But I want to return to that, looking at more generally of what it was like to transition from a place you were living in, you were writing about, you were reflecting and thinking deeply about, to a place you were taking newcomers that were seen for the first time, and what that experience was like in leading a pilgrimage of meditators from a dozen different countries, as you mentioned, to these sites that you had researched so well, what you learned as a pilgrimage leader, what insights that brought you as a practitioner, and then also the contrast between India and Burma. I know you did a lot more work in Burma, both in terms of writing and living and researching and leading pilgrimages as well, but you did lead one pilgrimage in Burma, so you do have that contrast. So just looking at your background as a pilgrimage leader and what that brought you.
But just for the record, I didn't lead the pilgrimage in Burma. You led the pilgrimage in Burma, and I was just your support.
Well, I learned a lot from you, let me say.
Yeah, but I definitely, I did not want to pose myself as a leader because I definitely didn't have the knowledge or experience to be a leader. But what have I learned as being a pilgrimage leader in India? I learned a few things. I learned how to manage people's expectations. I learned how to manage time. In the beginning, it was very easy to just try packing in way too much, as we did. I don't know if you remember, but on that first pilgrimage that we did in Burma, we were just,
it was insane.
Exhausted. It was insane.
Yeah.
And if you remember, we had a meeting at the very end, and I slashed about 40% of the visit.
Yeah, rightly so.
So managing time is really important, time and people's energy, because people want to do everything. Making optional things doesn't work. You can say we're going here, here, and here, and you can either rest in your room or we can go to this place. I don't know if you know the acronym FOMO.
Yeah.
Fear of missing out, right? And a lot of people suffer from fear of missing out.
Yeah.
And nobody, no matter how, only the wisest people, the wisest or just completely sick people, actually will stay
Yeah.
in their room. Most
Yeah.
people just want to soak in everything because they've dedicated this time and they've spent this money and they'll probably never come back again. So it's a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Hmm.
Let's just get in as much as possible.
Hmm.
So learning how to manage that and not create too much expectation. Because another thing is, especially in the beginning, it's so easy to say, "Oh, wait till we go to this place. The vibration is so pure, it's so powerful." And then we go to that place, and some people feel it, and other
Right.
people are like,
Right.
"Yeah, I don't feel anything,"
Right.
And then it just makes you look it just makes me, if I make those kind of statements and set up expectations,
Hmm.
I think it's unprofessional, and it shows maybe a little bit of lack of skill or wisdom on my part. So I try not to set up too much expectation. Managing conflict is really it's a skill that it's not something I deal with so much in the classroom, but you definitely develop the skill a lot as a parent, or as a community member, especially during a time of a pandemic, and on a pilgrimage, because it's exhausting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And like you said, people have different motivations for coming. They have different intentions. And I found it was even more so. Maybe it was just a luck of the draw, or maybe it was because of the country, but it was much more so the case on the pilgrimage that we went on. That was the most challenging pilgrimage
Yeah.
I've ever been on. And even Yearn,
Yeah.
who's quite an experienced pilgrimage guide. He
Hmm.
has actually much more experience as a guide than I do.
Hmm.
He also says to this day that was probably the most challenging pilgrimage he'd
Yeah.
been on,
Yeah.
because there was just so many people from, not just from different backgrounds, but just different intentions and expectations and
Yeah.
desires. Um, and I feel like a lot of the people who, it depends on the group. Sometimes you go in a group and everybody's a very experienced meditator and maybe they've already been to India. So it just flows more
Yeah.
easily. If somebody's never been to one of these countries and
Hmm.
they're actually a relatively new meditator, then you have to learn how to manage that
Hmm.
as well. Um, so time management, expectation management, conflict management, and resolution. Not And it's like when you're managing the conflict. And in Burma, if you remember, we weren't just in the middle; like we were part of the conflict. Like people had issues with us,
Hmm.
which was for whatever reason. Some of it might have been justified, some of it wasn't justified. And so, as a pilgrimage guide, you have to not only be prepared to deal with emergencies,
Hmm.
mental health emergencies, physical health
Hmm.
emergencies, which I've had to do, or conflicts between different pilgrims. But sometimes people are directing their negativity towards you for this reason or that reason. And uh, it's important to have the difficult conversations and to clear the air and be transparent, to help overcome the discomfort and the negativity. But you also have to know how far you're willing to go, because sometimes if in that very charged setting, if you go too far down the rabbit hole, it's going to drain you, and then that's going to impact all the other people who you're responsible for,
Yeah.
right? And so that's really important.
Hmm.
And so that was definitely learning on the job process.
Hmm.
Because it's not like there's formal training. I guess there is formal training for tour guides, but myself, I was just learning on the spot, so
Yeah.
it was a steep learning curve.
Yeah. Yeah. Pilgrimage is different than tours.
it's different for a tour, and maybe it would be helpful to go to tourism school. I'm not sure, but I think it's important to have a good, solid practice and really be able to maintain your equanimity in these various instances.
Yeah.
Be aware of everything that's going on, outside of the group that can influence the group. Be aware of everything, of all the dynamics, internal dynamics within the group, and develop equanimity and patience and empathy and metta and compassion. Because as soon as those qualities start to fade away, it just creates imbalance and chaos in the group. So
Yeah.
it's really important, and that's one of the things I just loved on the various pilgrimages that I've led. Was the challenge, was the test. For me, I
Yeah.
see it as like a
Yeah. Right.
course. It's
Right.
like a
Right.
meditation. It's a meditation
Yeah.
course in action,
Right.
a meditation course in movement.
Yeah.
It's obviously it's not the same as a 10-day course, but you have to really be prepared to face the sankharas that are coming up.
And how about the difference between India and Burma, between your role and if you're not, if you don't want to say you're a leader, you're definitely playing some kind of leading role and organizer in both of them. But just in having done so much in India and then just one in Burma, not on the pilgrim end, but on the organizational end, what did you find was similar, and what was different, and how were the challenges and the inspirations also manifesting?
I mean, like we spoke earlier, one of the in India, it's simpler because it's just there isn't the same level of historical and political complexity or even cultural complexity that pilgrims are going to be faced with. In India, you're going on a route. The places are distinct, but because they're mainly archaeological sites with a few practice sites scattered about. And whenever we're going to places to meditate, they're historical or archaeological sites, or they're vipassana centers in the Goenka tradition. And so there's a familiar, especially when you're always going to just like the Goenka centers, there's a familiarity that makes it easier. Whereas in Myanmar, it's just there's so much going on, so many different traditions and so many different practices, and we're meditating in all these different places, and there's so many different forms of vipassana. Sure, when you're on the pilgrimage route in India, you are encountering other traditions, and it's very lovely to you go to some stupa remains and you're meditating, and next to you there's a group of Thai forest monks on one side and
Mhm.
Cambodians on the other side, and maybe some Tibetans are doing some prostrations behind you. But like there's all these different people from different Buddhist worlds,
Mhm.
right? Whereas in Myanmar, it's like everybody's in this, Theravadan Burmese Buddhist world
Mhm.
with all these little nuanced differences.
Right.
But for most meditators in the Goenka tradition, when we think, a lot of people thought, oh, we're going to Burma. It's like everybody's practicing the Goenka method or Uvathid
Right.
method, right?
Right. Yeah.
And if they're not, it's still very similar. It's all like,
Mhm.
this kind of sensation-based practice.
Mhm.
And then, but then they're exposed to all this different stuff,
Right.
and that are also called vipassana. And so that made it challenging. I mean, some people found it fascinating
Yeah.
and were
Yeah.
really, they, loved learning about it. And
Mhm.
other people, you could see it was very disruptive
Yeah.
for them. So having to manage that or just be exposed to that and explain it, that sometimes that was a challenge that we don't really see in both places. Um, what other differences? Another big difference is just I'd say a huge difference is the interaction with the local community. Because in India, the local community is not Buddhist for the most part.
Right.
When we find Buddhists in India, they're more towards the south central India in Maharashtra or in Uttar Pradesh. But even though the Buddhist circuit is the pilgrimage circuit is part of it, a lot of it is in Uttar Pradesh. It doesn't necessarily touch the actual living Buddhist communities, or there's a lot of living Buddhist communities up in the Himalayas. So when we're encountering locals, most locals are Hindu and Muslim, and they just see us as their customers, right? It's a very business relationship, and like, although when we're in India, we'd either be staying in centers or we would stay in some kind of monastery. But even the monasteries were still very much a guest house. So it was like a sort of a spiritual business, if we can call it that. It's not like purely like a traditional monastery that we'd find in a host Buddhist country, because they're monasteries, but they're actually, it's more accurate to call them pilgrimage rest houses. And a lot of them are business oriented. And the people who are working there, maybe the manager might be, if we're staying in a Burmese monastery, maybe the manager is Burmese, or if it's in a Tibetan monastery, the manager is Tibetan. But for the most part, everyone working there, cooking and cleaning, etc., are local Indians, and so they just see us as these clients. Whereas in Burma, it's like we were their visitors. And sure, there might have been some business aspect, but people were just so happy to have us come. And that was what was just so beautiful, like the cultural pride that people had in Burma compared to India. It was one of the most beautiful things to see is this pride that the people of Myanmar have in their culture. And that the fact that here's this group of international people, when we went on our pilgrimage, I think we were from 12 or 13 different countries. We were like maybe 23, 25 people. And people were just so happy to see us. No matter where we went, people's arms were just open, especially when we dressed in the traditional pilgrimage clothing. I remember it was like, I think it was on the first day or second day, and we got our brown lungi, and we were asked to bring white shirts, and our tabet, the sash was a brown sash. We went. I think we went to Chodaji, and I remember when you and Snow, passed around the lungis and the sashes, and a lot of us were feeling really uncomfortable. Like, oh my God, I'm wearing a uniform. I don't wear uniforms. I like my freedom of individuality. I want to express my individualism. Like, what is this uniform nonsense? But we're like, okay, we're going to do it, just this once for Snow. And, we all put it on, and we sheepishly file off out of the bus. And like, there's all these Burmese people just looking at us. And at first, I'm like so embarrassed. But then you see they're taking pictures and they're smiling. And they come and like shake our hands and talk to us and ask us where we're from. And they're so happy. They're just so happy and so honored that here's this group of people from who knows where. Like, we're, for all intents and purposes, we're from another planet. Here's these aliens coming dressed the way they do, in their most sacred attire, lay attire. And so they were just so happy. And even though we're like awkward and we're like wearing our lungis wrong and we might do inappropriate things, they're just so happy that we're just showing interest in a very sincere way. And they recognize that our intentions are good and pure, and they're in the right place. So, that kind of thing. Like, I remember one time it was after the first. I went on 2 pilgrimages in Myanmar. The first one I think was 2003 with Goenka, which I said, and then ours was 2014. And I remember after the pilgrimage in 2003, or maybe it was in the first few days we spent in Yangon, and there was a small group of us. We went to Sule Pagoda to meditate. And when we come out of our meditation, we're surrounded by drinks and chips and chocolate and fruit. And they were so quiet, like I didn't even hear anybody do anything. So, and when I opened my eyes, we were maybe 5 or 6 people. We open our eyes and we're just surrounded by all this Donna. It was just, wow, amazing. So this pride and this culture of Donna, we don't see, we might get some glimpses here and there in India, but nothing like in Myanmar. Nothing. It's really, it's out of this world. I and other stories. I remember we on that first pilgrimage, we were going from Mandalay to Moniwa to the Lady Sayadaw Monastery in Moniwa or outside of Moniwa. I can't remember exact location. You probably know better than I do. But it was a long drive. And don't forget, we're 500 people on like 15 different buses. And if one bus stopped, we all had to stop. And so, I don't know. The drive is supposed to be, what, a couple of hours between the two? Do you know offhand?
Mandalay to Moniwa, maybe like 3 hours or so. Yeah, 3 hours, something like that.
3 hours. It probably took us like double that because buses breaking down and all this. And we were late. And somehow the people in Moniwa learned that we didn't have our lunch. So they, like a group of people from Moniwa, a few cars, drove to meet us halfway to offer us snacks, water and fruit and chips and all these, snacky foods, because they thought we'd be hungry because we didn't have a chance to eat lunch. And we were 500 people. That's a lot of snacks. It's not like just a small group. We were a lot of people, and they brought, 500 of everything. So it was just that level of giving and that ability to just give yourself over to somebody else. It just produces they were just so happy to give. And then just as a recipient, so much joy, so much piti was produced by seeing how happy they were in giving to us. It was just such a memorable lesson that I've always, kept with me. I don't know if you remember, but we went to on our pilgrimage, we went to the Ong Zabu Tawia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, where they have some Japanese donor gave 300 precious statues.
Yep.
And so when we were there, the abbot closed off the exhibit,
right,
just so that we can enjoy observing and pay attention and meditating with the statues quietly and mindfully without the disturbance of all the tourists. I remember outside there was like hordes of people waiting to get in. And they closed it off completely for our little group. And there was these few nuns in the corner who were chanting some paritas to enhance the atmosphere. It was so beautiful. And then afterwards, we go outside and there was a tea shop. And so we were having some tea. And one of the people in our group had a bag with lots of money in it. And this person, we get on, we have our tea, we get on the bus, we leave. And she's like, oh my God, I left my bag with all my money. And we're like, oh no. And moments later, the abbot called your phone or Snow's phone and said, I think somebody left their bag filled with valuables. Come back and pick it up. I'm 99% sure if that happened in India,
right,
forget it. That bag would not have been seen.
Yeah.
But the people were so the Shila is, there's such an importance in Shila and in gratitude that they saw here we're host to these foreign visitors. They fell into trouble. Let's help. And that was so beautiful that there wasn't one penny missing. Everything was there. That the person who
Mm.
found it at the tea shop, had the mindfulness and compassion to go to the abbot and say, I think this belongs to, the foreigners. Amazing. Just,
Right. And that
yeah.
wasn't just several $100s, even several $1,000s. That was actually tens of thousands of dollars in that purse, which makes it all the more stunning and
Yeah.
remarkable. And yeah, your memory of all these details, it's really wonderful to recount and to recall. When you were referencing your first trip in 2003 and the bus breaking down, and the support you received, the thing that came to my mind was when we visited Saipianji, the birthplace of Lady Sayadaw. Do you remember that encounter?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, tell us, tell the audience how we were greeted in going to that little village.
Yeah, that was an interesting visit. I remember. Well, we go into the shrine room, or it was a Dhamma hall, and like all this food was prepared for
Well,
us.
even before that, even when we were on the road, do you remember what happened on the road?
Like, was that like were we stopped by police?
No, that was there was a turnoff to go to this little village. This is the village where Lady Sayadaw was born. You
Yeah,
can see his
yeah,
birthplace, and
yeah,
there's some other famous sites associated with the miracle of his birth and the
yeah.
stories. When we turned off on this road, they had sent like a greeting party at the head of the road to like formally greet us and welcome us,
Oh
and it
yeah,
was basically like we were like paraded. It was like people on both sides of the road with at least two or three people filming everything on video camera, like massive video cameras. And like, I don't know
yeah,
if it was
yeah,
like the local station or whatever, but it was this enormous festival ground of welcoming, leading on the road to the monastery village. And as we got off, yeah, then your memory kicks in where they then had this huge feast prepared for us inside the monastery, and just this incredibly welcoming, almost carnival atmosphere. And as we sat and looked at the relics of Lady's life and paid respects and everything,
yeah,
all the villagers were just their faces just pressed against the window in the building outside, and just staring endlessly, fascinated by why we should come from all corners of the world to their little humble village.
yeah.
And then what was funny was the next pilgrimage that you weren't on, but I was really curious what they were going to do, because they had already laid out this red carpet in such incredible ways. Like, how are they
Yeah.
going to respond the second time? And what was so funny was they welcomed us quite generously the second time as well. But instead of video cameras recording us, they had televisions playing the tape from last month, like just streaming. So like as we were there paying our respects, we're also like watching the feed from the previous month's visit. So that really cracked me
That's
up.
so funny. That's so funny. And I remember, I don't know if it was police or the military, because I know it was a politically sensitive spot.
Hmm.
There were some police who showed up, and they're like, who are these people? Are they government spies? What's going on? And they were watching they were quite stern, and they were watching the Sangha Donna that we had offered. And we had done the movements, and we were repeating after the Sayadaw, and we were chanting the blessing, and we just got everything we were so off key on everything,
Right.
and like everybody was just laughing, and then it was so humorous, that everyone was giggling. Like the police couldn't contain, or the army, the
Mm,
soldiers couldn't contain themselves as well, and they
mm,
also started laughing. And
mm,
then it's like from that moment on, everything was okay. It's like, okay,
mm.
these people are sincere pilgrims, devotees of the great Lady Sayadaw. They're not here to cause any trouble. Yeah, that was a really special place as well. I actually have a little altar at home, and I have a little twig from the tree.
Mm.
I think is it a tamarind tree, maybe? Can't remember.
Yeah, the famous tree, it's tamarind. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a tamarind tree. So I have like a little, maybe 3-4 inches, a little branch that was on the ground.
Hmm.
So I have that, on my altar
Hmm.
next to the Buddha statue that Snow had actually given me at the end of the tour. Yeah, it's just the sense of Donna, the culture of Donna is just so wonderful.
It is, and they really celebrate meditation in all forms. So there's really no barriers between some other yogi's progress and dedication and their support of it. It's really a absolute no boundaries rejoicing of anyone who's choosing that path. And I think that's what makes it, in better times, which now is definitely not, that's what makes Myanmar such a special spiritual experience of those who go to spend time, is that this activity, which can look so weird and ostracized, well, maybe not so much in 2022. Definitely, we're making headway with how practice is becoming normalized. But still, to some extent, it's not something that's really embraced and integrated into the culture. Whereas in Myanmar, there's just anywhere you can go to practice. Pagodas, open places. It's as you mentioned, you go to this pagoda and meditate with your eyes closed. You open them, and there's a host of snacks and treats to support you. Just pure happiness and giving and rejoicing, really, and really seeing how you doing this action benefits me as well, and I want to give. And so that's really profound. I do have to balance that with, this is the rational and critical. Well, rational is the wrong word. The more critical part coming in to not just give this romanticized version to leave people with, but to balance just the nuanced and difficult reality, because all of this is true. Everything we're saying here, this is what actually happens, and people do rejoice to great extents. And you did close your eyes meditating and have snacks given to you. This all really happened. And yet I have to balance that with a story I heard last month in a podcast we published with Lin Thant, who was a political prisoner. And he describes a scene in prison where he was meditating, and after one meditation session, the prison guard beat him, and 3 days later, that prison guard died in a car accident, just coincidentally. But because the other prison guards, who were all Buddhist, they started to suspect that he had some magical power of inflicting karma back on him immediately after this happened. And so they became terrified whenever they saw him meditate. And he was on death row for 8 years. He ended up surviving. He's now one of the leaders of the democratic movement. But for those 8 years on death row, whenever the guards saw him meditate, they would take him out of the cell and beat him to a pulp. And he would explain to them, what I'm doing is not for the revolution. I'm doing this for my peace of mind. And you will also benefit in this. You, as a Burmese Buddhist, knowing well to rejoice in meditation, this is also good for you. This is word for word what he said on our podcast interview. This is something that is just trying to help me have a peace of mind and a balance. And by having that, I will make the atmosphere in general better. And so you'll also benefit from this. But they didn't understand. And can you imagine just to be deprived of everything except the ability to sit in silence? And then they also try to take that away from you. And they also, a regime that justifies its existence to protect Buddhism is then beating people who practice Buddhist meditation. And so this is, and it's like some hesitation. I share this even though it's already been shared on my platform, because I don't want to I don't say that to challenge the existence of this reverence or of this rejoicing, which is very true. And I don't want to dirty that picture of the reality of so many foreign meditators who come to the country and are just anywhere they go, they're told, you keep up this practice, you can stay for life. I will take care of you. You dedicate yourself to this and leave everything else to me. You stay as long as you want. This is my privilege to be able to support you with as little as I have. It's my privilege to be able to give you this spiritual path. That is true. And it's also true that this happened in prison, and we can't, I think at a time like this, we can't not acknowledge that happening. We don't want to be a party pooper, but we also, it's, we need to somehow be mature enough that we can hold both those realities somehow.
Yeah. How do we square that circle? It's, it's horrible. It just makes me just want to cry out when I hear those kind of stories.
Yeah.
It's such high level of ignorance.
Yeah.
And fear and hatred. And this is the work that we're doing. This is the work that we're doing ultimately, is to diminish and eradicate our craving, our aversion, our ignorance. And what you just described is the highest form of ignorance and fear and hatred. And I can't possibly imagine what it's like to be in such a horrible situation. And my heart goes out to that person, and obviously to the people of Myanmar. And I can say I'm going to, I send metta, and I talk about the issues with people, but it's still never enough. And it just comes back to what I was saying earlier. We're unenlightened, sleeping human beings, just live very complicated, messy lives, and just perpetuate more of the poison. And we see how these poisons go from the sort of internal psychological level, and they manifest, at the level of individual behavior and collective behavior, and even systemic. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. It's really horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
And
there's,
it shows, I guess it does show that you're right. Nothing is neat. So we have, on the one hand, and this is what I love about, obviously, what I always say, people always ask me, why do you love going to India? And I say, in some ways there's like so much extremes, and I learned so much from it. You have the highest wisdom, and you have the lowest ignorance. You have such great richness, and you have such poverty. And there's such wisdom and ignorance, and all this. And we see the same thing in Myanmar. We have these, enlightened meditation masters doing so much good for the world. And the repercussions ripple out across the globe. And at the same time, we have these really dangerous, ignorant people causing so much trauma and pain and grief and suffering. And it's like you have both of them side by side. You have the Dhamma energy, and you have that Mara energy, and it's really that's just the reality as it is. And it's, those negative sides is just very painful to see. And so how can we bear witness to that, and stay
yeah.
grounded at the same time?
Yeah. It was extremely difficult to hear. I mean, I get emotional even thinking about it. And I was almost in tears hearing the description.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of terrible stories from Myanmar, from prisons, from, anecdotes, from podcasts, things behind the scenes. I can never share with confidentiality. I've been broken down several times this year, with the horrors that have been told, and some of the horrors that have been inflicted on, where the horrors come into line with Dhamma. Another story that comes to mind is a nunnery with a number of young nuns in the Sagaing Hills, children that were nuns, with that for some reason, on some tip, the military, or actually they weren't even dressed in fatigues, young men in weapons climbed the walls and stormed through the nunnery at midnight. And when the abbess came out to ask what they were doing, they simply beat her with the butt of the gun in front of the children, and beat her until she couldn't get up. And, I saw pictures of those robes. I saw videos, audio and video of the beating taking place, and of the people screaming out, and the way the young nuns were so traumatized. And yeah, that was another thing that just completely broke me, hearing about such defenseless, kind people that were being beaten to that extent. And I get choked up just thinking about that one. And, just realizing that there is no other explanation of this than fascism. I mean, this is just an example of fascist ideology that does not make sense in the humane way we look at the world. But this story of Lin Thant in prison, this was also another order. I mean, you think of, as I said on that interview with him, you think of meditation or yoga as being these things that open the body and mind up and make it vulnerable, and it's a courageous act to come in contact with something that you're not facing in your consciousness, and to welcome that vulnerability, and then to be beaten physically every time you do that. I mean, he was beaten every meditation. Every morning he would wake up at 4 a.m. He would prostrate and do recitation, the suttas, and then he would meditate, and then they would see him and they would drag him out and they would beat him, and this happened day after day, and
Wow.
the particular, I didn't even know what to ask him. I had the horror of that contrast. It was like,
Yeah.
you'd like to think that if you're in a cell so small you can't even stand up, that meditation is truly the one thing they can't take away from you. You'd like to think that's the thing you're left with, that's your refuge. And they didn't take it away from him, but I don't know how he held on. There's not many stories I hear that I think, well, I would have been done. Not that I'm a courageous person where it's like, I could have done that or I could have done that. But when I heard this one, I was like, I would have been done. 8 years on death row, not seeing the sun or the moon, not having personal interaction, not being given edible food, and then being beaten for meditation. I would have given up hope. I'm sorry. I would have said, I carried this on as long as I could. I'm done. And, the flip side of that story, of the horrible story of being beaten, assaulted for meditation, is that he didn't stop. And not only did he not stop meditation, but he said, I have never held hatred for these people who did this to me. Not for the jailers, not for the generals, not for the warden. No one, not a day in my life have I held hatred, because I know this is toxic. And he said, when other activists hear me say this, they'll be angry at me, for like degrading the revolution, that I don't have this hatred for them. But I honestly, I don't, and I can't. And to make that contradiction even more confounding for those of us outside, he's also in full support of the armed rebellion. He's not just supporting it philosophically, but he's in a position to ensure that the local defense forces are able to efficiently kill the top Metta soldiers as effectively as possible, seeing that as the only solution for an evil that is not responding any other way. And so, this man who is beaten day after day, year after year, and doesn't hold hatred to his Buddhist guards who are giving him the beating, is also helping to see an armed rebellion happening that knowingly is going to is going to have a toll of human life. And so these are, I think bearing witness is the right word for this, because our lives are so privileged and so removed from having to make any of these decisions, that to sermonize or to remind of orthodox scriptural teachings from our place is just, it's not something I can do. But to listen and to ask and to want to know these stories and tell these stories, to know this is happening and to understand the why, I think as a practitioner at this time, to not bypass the place and the people where so much of these teachings have come from. I think, I don't know, I'm still struggling. What is the most that we can do, and what is the most that I can do? But certainly I think that's part of it.
Well, I mean, I think that's where your podcast has been fantastic, formidable. that it's allowing a space for people to tell their stories and share it with the rest of the world, because it's virtually impossible for most people on the outside to be in contact with people on the inside. So having these stories available to us is such a great service that you're doing. So I really applaud you for that. When I hear the story of this gentleman who's been in prison for so long, facing death row, to me, he's just such his adhitthana, his strong determination to just keep practicing no matter what, is just it's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it's so inspiring. It's like, if
Hmm.
I'm too tired at night, maybe I don't want to sit.
Hmm.
It's so, like, for now on, I'm just going to think of him every day when I
Right.
meditate. Like, if he can meditate, man, I can meditate.
Hmm.
And on the other hand, like, he's just such a great. I don't know him, but just, and I haven't heard that podcast, so I'm not familiar with who he is. But just from what you're telling me, he just seems like such a powerful symbol of equanimity, right? I mean, we hear stories in the canon of a monk getting beaten, and he's just sending metta. Or there's the story of this man who wants to rape a nun because he thinks her eyes are so beautiful, so she, like, you know removes her eye from her eye socket and hands it to the guy. What's so beautiful about this? Like, who can do that kind of thing? and
Hmm.
and so this is a living example of these deep teachings that seem so far removed from reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
We're actually seeing the teachings in their most in the hardest contexts, in
Yeah.
the most challenging contexts. Like, how it can't get harder than that,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And so when I see these people actually meditating, it's so inspiring. Um, it reminds me of the story I when I did that study abroad program to go to India, the first trimester. It was through the University of Minnesota, and I was in Minnesota for a couple of months, and there was a Tibetan monk who came and gave a talk at the university, and he had been in prison for 20 years. And somebody asked him, like, what was your biggest fear? And he said his biggest fear was losing compassion for the prison guards.
Hmm.
That was his biggest concern while he was in prison for 20 years. And I thought to myself, man, this person is just practicing on a whole other level. Like, I just, it's so hard to understand and relate to what he's saying. I hope, well, one, I hope I never find myself in that kind of situation.
Hmm.
I don't want anyone to ever have to find themselves in that situation.
Hmm.
But if I ever do find myself in a time of great difficulty, I hope I can maintain my level-headedness and my compassion for whoever's creating these conditions of suffering for me. So it's and it's I don't want to, like, I understand how people might get upset in Burma when people on the outside say, "Oh, they're just so resilient. How
Right.
wonderful." I
Right.
understand how that could be insulting if it's not said from a place of authenticity. Like, I think it all depends on who the speaker is and what position the person is speaking these words from. Um, it can just be as it can be used as just a way to bypass action or serious reflection. But on the other hand, it can also be expressed as a genuine, sincere observation of what these incredibly strong people are going through and how they're responding to the situation with wisdom. So, it's complex. And you're right. There's just, I hate to say it, and I don't want to sound, in the former, as the former speaker, the people who are going through this, it's terrible. but they're providing, such a great lesson, because the world is moving in a very dangerous position, in a very dangerous place. There's so much division, there's so much conflict everywhere, even in North America and the US. Look, we see what's happening with the political scene, the polarization between the left and the right. We see some of this in Canada as well. When I just look, I live in very quiet, tranquil, rural area, and some of my neighbors, really symbolize the tranquility of the area, and some are very loud, rowdy, gun-toting
Mm,
individuals. And if things go bad, I could see people reacting in very harmful ways.
mm,
And when I see what the people in Myanmar are going through right now,
mm.
um, some of them are just responding in such courageous ways that I hope that if I'm ever in that position, that I could be as strong as they are.
Yeah.
So I thank them. I thank them, for all the trouble they're going through. They're still serving as teachers for me. I learned
Mm,
so much when I was there, and
mm,
I'm still learning so much about equanimity and nonviolence. And even the people who are there's people who are practicing nonviolence. There's people who are practicing guerrilla warfare. I'm not judging, one or the other. I have no right to judge. All I could do is observe and pay attention to the best of my ability of what's going on. I'm not making any evaluations, but people are doing what they think is right in face of this horrible situation. And it's just another way. They're just demonstrating another great way to put the Buddha's teaching in practice.
yeah, well said. And I think that's probably a good place to end. Those are some powerful thoughts, and good to touch upon the current situation, and our thoughts and awareness of and support of what that is. And yeah, boy, really, really thank you for taking the time to talk so much about your life, and especially the role of along the path and the pilgrimages you led and observations, and just really appreciated all this.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a nice opportunity to chat with you and talk about this place that's really, even though I've only been a couple of times for about a month, but Myanmar is definitely close to my heart, and it's the quality of interaction, not the quantity.
Hmm.
It's I Yeah, it's a place that I love, and I really do hope to be able to go back one day when things eventually get better, whenever that may be.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you again. Thank you for coming on and sharing your background.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
I'll be honest, not only is asking for donations my least favorite thing in the world to do, I find it pretty uncomfortable as well. Yet, it is an unavoidable but necessary task in order to ensure that our platform can continue to bring you stories from post-coup Myanmar. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that there is a basic minimum cost to keep our engine humming. So please allow me to take a moment for that least favorite and uncomfortable thing to do, and ask sincerely for your generosity in supporting our mission. If you found value in today's show and think others might as well, we ask that you take a moment to consider supporting our work. Thank you for taking the time to hear our spiel. And with that, it's off to work on the next episode. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.